Now, Alan Shipton tells the story of swing at the BBC in the Archive Hour.
This is London Calling. Santos Kasani, the famous teacher of dancing.
This new dance being introduced to this country consists of different variations taken from the blues, tango, Charleston and black bottom, formed into one dance and danced to the music of the blues. The principal points to remember are as follows. 1. You dance on the ball of your foot and not on your toes. 2. You get this sway not by bending and straightening the knees, but by swaying the top part of your body slightly from side to side. 3. Your weight is gradually transferred from one leg on to the other. 4. That you dance in slow time, each step taking 2 beats unless you double time, then there is a beat to each step.
Even before the swing era began, there was swing at the BBC. In the wake of the frantic Dixieland that launched the Jazz Age, there were larger bands or tight-knit small groups whose four-to-the-bar rhythm had Britain dancing from the 20s to the war years and beyond. In the early days of radio, almost buried among the talks, the spoken contributions of such worthies as theatre critic James Agate, diarist Harold Nicholson, and even the chairman of the British Broadcasting Company himself, Lord Gainford, there was the music of the Savoy Orpheans. The BBC Sound Archive contains a snapshot history of jazz and swing in Britain, but the organisation created this almost despite itself, owing to the controversies that the music brought about, both among the mandarins inside the organisation and amid the public at large. For the next hour, I'll be exploring the issues behind the music, not to mention some great moments in jazz history. In the 1920s, the BBC broadcast from its original studios in Savoy Hill, and there were regular relays from the nearby Savoy Hotel. There was also a Saturday night show by Ambrose and his orchestra from the Mayfair Hotel, and that began in March 1927. It helped to make his discs all the more popular when they turned up among the light opera and ballad singers of general music programmes.
That was the Lily of Laguna on his master's voice, B2902. The organist was Leslie James. Next we come to a dance record, a slow foxtrot played by Ambrose and his orchestra. You may have heard him play this over the air on Saturday nights. Personally, I always think a slow foxtrot shows Ambrose at his best.
part of Ambrose's recording of Whistling in the Dark, Sam Brown singing the vocal and an anonymous member of the orchestra providing the whistling. Ambrose's band was one of three heard regularly on the BBC in 1927 and 28 in programmes of dance music that went out between 3 and 7 nights a week. Along with Ambrose and the Savoy Orpheans, there was also a much jazzier ensemble led by a Philippine-born Cambridge law student called Fred Elizalde. His band was packed with American jazz stars like the bass saxophonist Adrian Rollini, trumpeter Chelsea Quealy, and the tenor saxophonists Fudd Livingston and Arthur Rollini, Adrian's brother. The band appealed to the growing number of jazz fans in Britain, and indeed it was voted top broadcasting band by the readers of a newish magazine called Melody Maker for pieces like this, Singapore Sorrows. Fred Elizalde's Savoy Orchestra. Much as this band was popular among enthusiasts for jazz and swing, the BBC received hundreds of complaints from listeners. They hated the long, rambling musical introductions like the one on that disc, and in most such instrumental pieces, they wanted to know where the melody was. The result? In late 1928, the BBC dropped Elizalde's band. The editor of Melody Maker was furious. In the first of many articles chastising the BBC for its jazz policy, he wrote,
"We could not reconcile ourselves to the belief that the public was anything like crude enough in its appreciation and understanding of popular music to be satisfied with the often mediocre melodies of the majority of numbers issued so prolifically for its edification, seemingly with a delightfully nonchalant disregard of their intrinsic merit."
Elizalde's music, he argued, had plenty of merit and style was something sadly lacking in the music of his competitors. You might assume that having dropped the country's top hot jazz band as a favour to those listeners who wanted to be sure of the tune, or to know the names of the pieces they were hearing, the BBC's management had the interests of such listeners at heart. But in fact, almost simultaneously, they came up with a new policy that, during its brief existence, foxed the audience completely. There'd been great concern in official quarters about the fact that song pluggers might be influencing commercial sales of discs by having their latest releases played on the radio. So Gerald Koch, the head of Outside Broadcasts, came up with a foolproof scheme to keep listeners to the relays from the Savoy or Mayfair hotels in the dark.
With immediate effect, we shall introduce a ban on all vocal numbers, and we shall also ensure that no speech microphone is provided for band leaders. That will prevent them from telling the public what numbers they've played or are about to play. And if anyone tries to shout out the names of the numbers, they can be faded out at once.
Needless to say, this policy drew even more complaints, along with a mountain of letters inquiring about the anonymous music that was being played. So the BBC had to bow to public pressure and once more allow vocals and announcements from its various dance bands. Before long, the corporation did a complete about-face and formed its own band. It's an old BBC trick. Suspect something new, test public opinion, and, according to how the land lies, then invent your own version of the novelty, going one better than the competition. The BBC Dance Band was led by Henry Hall, and it's a measure of its importance within the organisation that it provided the first sounds to be heard when Broadcasting House opened on the 15th of March 1932. Henry Hall's blend of jazz and light music monopolised the airwaves for much of the 1930s.
Hello, everybody. Guess what program this is? You give up? It's the BBC Dance Orchestra under the direction of Henry Hall, coming to you through the courtesy of and by the grace of and through no fault of my own. And for your amusement tonight, we present the haunting strains of Molly, Mari, and Mary, the warbling of Don Donovan and George Elric, and as our guests tonight, Jimmy Kennedy and Michael Carr. And least but not Oliver Wakefield, the voice of inexperience, saying, "Good night, everybody. Good night."
Just a moment, Oliver. This is no time for saying good night. We haven't begun the program yet.
Oh, I'm terribly sorry, Henry. I don't usually let little things like a program worry me, but of course, if you insist on your little... the first number will be It Had to Be You.
It Had to Be You from the Henry Hall Hour in April 1936. This programme was a mixture of swing standards by the band, vocals by various guest singers, comic turns by the likes of Oliver Wakefield, and a diet of fairly syrupy dance numbers. Songwriters also dropped in to give whistle-stop tours of their work, and although these were mainly fairly standard Wardour Street composers and lyricists, just occasionally the show featured someone a cut above the ordinary.
And now I want to introduce Johnny Mercer to you, just before we play another well-known tune of his.
Good evening, everyone. This is the first opportunity I've had of speaking to you all over the radio in this country. And as I am sailing for America tomorrow, I would like you to know that I certainly have enjoyed my visit to England. The tune Henry is going to play is one I wrote in Hollywood with Fred Astaire.
Will you sing it for us, Johnny?
All right, but I warn you, you're building up to an awful letdown. Up to an awful letdown by playing around with you. Oh, you're breaking down my terrific build-up by treating me as you do. My smile so debonair, my castles in the air, my one big love affair Is it just a flash? Will it go to smash like the 1929 market crash? I'm building up to an awful letdown by falling in love with you.
Johnny Mercer was just one of the American guests who appeared on BBC Radio during the 30s. Another was a singer who'd moved to Britain in 1931 and who was a regular favourite on To Town with Two Pianos, Adelaide Hall.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a little number that's very popular in the States entitled Minnie the Moocher. Now, the word moocher is just an American slang for a young girl that's out stealing other girls' sweethearts. Now here's the story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a low-down hoochie coocher. She was the roughest, toughest frail, but Minnie had a heart as big as a whale. Heart, a heart, ha, ha. Oh, my
Adelaide Hall. And there were other Americans who had a big impact on the BBC's output of swing and dance music in the 1930s. Colorado-born Roy Fox, for example, broadcast every Wednesday from the Monseigneur restaurant in Piccadilly, and his band introduced listeners to the trumpet of Nat Ganella and the piano playing of Lou Stone, who eventually took over the group. Here's how they sounded under Stone's... This is a piece by the London-born Afro-German composer Reginald Forsyth. He not only broadcast regularly himself as Adelaide Hall's accompanist, but he also wrote arrangements for such American jazz giants as Earl Hines and Paul Whiteman, and they were every bit as atmospheric as this, Garden of Weed. Reginald Forsyth's evocative Ellingtonian writing for the Lou Stone Band was a good example of the free interchange of ideas that went on in the 30s between British and American musicians, Forsyth himself enjoying a career on both sides of the Atlantic. During that same period, drummer and bandleader Billy Cotton used to collect the latest arrangements from those dance groups that played on transatlantic liners. He'd pick them up every time they docked at Liverpool while his band was resident in nearby Stockport. Henry Hall went one better. At the suggestion of the critic Leonard Feather, he hired one of America's leading composers and multi-instrumentalists, Benny Carter, as a BBC staff arranger, although, as Benny pointed out to Charles Fox in a 1970s interview, his employment was somewhat precarious.
I came in and I was only on, temporary work permits, and I had to leave periodically and, apply for a re-entry permit.
Yes.
And after a decent interval, they would allow me in again.
Yes.
And I was never refused the re-entry permit, but it was always sort of limiting in time and restrictive in the conditions. I couldn't play at all, I might mention.
I think you arrived sometime in the beginning of 1936, did you?
March, yes. When I say that I didn't know Leonard at the time, I knew him through his writings for the Melody Maker, but we hadn't met before, although he had been in the States before.
Anyway, he persuaded Henry Hall, who was leading the BBC Dance Orchestra at that time, that this would be a very sound idea, as of course it was a fine idea. How long were you over in London? And we were based in London, obviously, during this period.
Well, if I remember correctly, it seems to have been about 22 months off and on, but maybe it couldn't have been quite that long. I don't know. It might have been something like that.
Did you write many scores for the Henry Hall, for the BBC Dance Orchestra?
I wrote quite a number, but I don't remember just how many,
I remember that you made the saxophone section sound like one of your saxophone sections.
Oh? Don't remember too well.
I just wondered whether you took them through the scores yourself.
Oh, yes.
And so that you get them to play the way you wanted them to.
Try to interpret the phrasing I had in mind.
Because that seems very much part of the way you work, the way your scores come out, and that they sound like one of your saxophone sections,
Well, it was a very good saxophone section, actually. It was a very good orchestra. Musicians in there were excellent, very high standards.
Button your shoe, put on your coat and hat. I play a game like that while I'm waiting for you. 3, 4, open the door, hurry for heaven's sake. I count each step you take while I'm waiting for you. 5, 6, my heart does tricks as I picture all your charms. 7, 8, you're at the gate and you walk into my arms. 9, 10, kiss me again, tell me you get a thrill, just as I hope you will while I'm waiting for you.
Henry Hall's band playing an arrangement by Benny Carter, and typical of Benny's writing those long, sinuous saxophone lines and the idea of pushing the rhythm section forward in the mix so that the guitar has a similar role to that of its American counterparts. Having established strong links with the Americans in its swing output, the BBC was nonetheless also interested in talent closer to home. A couple of years after Leonard Feather helped bring Benny Carter to the BBC, he also organised the first broadcast by a young blind pianist who was making a name for himself in London, George Shearing. When I interviewed George on Radio 3 for his 80th birthday in 1999, he looked back at that first broadcast, beginning with the theme tune that Feather wrote for him. Feather's Mighty Like the Blues. And George, I think that was a tune that goes back a very long way in your connection with the BBC.
It does. As a matter of fact, Alan, I played it 61 years ago in, I want to say 1938, that's what it would be. That was my first broadcast with the BBC, and it was really when I was still speaking like a broad Cockney. Because after playing that, I played a medley of tunes, and, the announcer came on and he said, for the next 15 minutes, you'll be hearing the music of George Shearing. And I started this, and then I played a medley of tunes, and then I came on and I said, good morning, everybody. We just played a medley of commercial popular numbers, including Tears on My Pillow, Let Me Whisper I Love You, Magyar Melody, and Jeepers Creepers. For the past 15 minutes, we've been hearing the music of George Shearing. That taught me to dispense with the Cockney voice.
George Shearing talking to me back in 1999 on his 80th birthday. From the time of George's first broadcast in 1938, right through until his permanent departure for the USA in 1947, George was a regular on BBC Radio, part of a patchwork of different kinds of swing reflected on the air, from soloists like George himself to small groups and then big bands. These ranged from Ambrose and his orchestra to Jack Payne's own BBC dance band, which succeeded Henry Hall's. George himself was a member of Ambrose's band, and he worked with musicians like Harry Parry, Buddy Featherstone-Hoare and Kenny Baker. I'll come to Kenny Baker in a moment, but Buddy Featherstone-Hoare's Radio Rhythm Club Sextet was one of the most popular of all the wartime swing bands. As I found out from the guitarist Vic Lewis, who played with the band, one reason for this was that the group started out as a service unit.
During the war, I was posted to Bomber Command headquarters, and one day the CO called me and said, at that time I was a sergeant, he said, Sergeant Lewis, there's a band being posted here, and I want you to take care of them. So I go outside and I bump into Buddy Featherstone-Hoare and Jack Parnell, all the guys who I knew, and they said, we didn't know you were here. Well, we'll make each RAF station had 5-piece bands sent down there. But they said, well, in this case, why don't you join us and we'll make it a sextet. So I recorded with Buddy Featherstone-Hoare, the sextet. We made about 20 or 30 records for what was called the BBC Radio Rhythm Club.
How Am I to Know? The Radio Rhythm Club Sextet, led by tenorist Buddy Featherston-Hall, with Don McAfee on trombone and the ebullient Kenny Baker on trumpet. Before his demob from the RAF, Kenny'd managed to make dozens of broadcasts as a freelance, and he was already making plans to start his own band. But as luck would have it, it was due to the BBC that instead he wound up joining one of Britain's finest ever swing groups, the Ted Heath Orchestra.
We all knew this lovely BBC producer who was pretty well known in those days for trying to put music on the air, Mr. Pat Dixon. He had a programme called Top 10. And sometimes I fronted a band, sometimes Ted did. And it was a sort of regular weekly programme of all the top tunes that Pat took charge of. And out of that, I have a feeling that Ted did quite a lot of the actual shows, and that was the beginning of the Heath Band, although it wasn't known as a Heath Band then. It was just a bunch of guys working together.
Ted Heath's orchestra, featuring Kenny Baker on his own composition Bakerloo Non-Stop. Well, just as in the 1930s, American visitors and arrangers had had a big impact on the sound of homegrown jazz on the BBC, the war years continued that transatlantic influence. No band had more effect than that of Major Glenn Miller. He broadcast regularly to the Allied forces from Britain following his arrival here in 1944, and his band continued to have its concerts broadcast on the BBC even after Miller's disappearance in December of that year. Here's a relay from Paris, made a month or two after Miller vanished.
20:30 Friday night. Time for music and one of your three main AEF orchestras. This is a recording of a performance given by the American band of the AEF on the continent.
This is the music of Major Glenn Miller's American Band of the AEF on the continent, conducted by Chief Arranger Sergeant Jerry Gray. Music for and by members of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. Hello, everybody. This is Warrant Officer Paul Dudley. Well, once again, we're ready to come swinging past your radio in a 30-minute review. And strutting proudly along at the head of the parade comes a sharp and successful musical citizen in the mood.
It's hard to estimate just what a colossal effect that tune, In the Mood, had on the general public during the tail end of the war. And it wasn't just Miller's band who contributed to that feeling.
Joe Loss played there, and it seemed every time he started playing In the Mood, we had an air raid.
it was something that really gripped you. It really got hold of you, and you couldn't stand still. There was no way you could keep any part of your body still when that was playing. I mean, people were dancing, people were jiving or trying to jive, or jitterbug as people had seen on films. And it's been part of my life right up until now. It just captures romance.
Glenn fixed it up so that it would be very attractive to the dancers with those surprise endings that he had on it. So the dancers had an awful lot of fun doing it, and we were well aware of that, but we didn't know that the record was going to be that big a hit. I suppose we thought that most anything we recorded was hopefully going to be a hit.
Trombonist Paul Tanner, a member of Glenn Miller's AEF band. Miller's band became hugely popular throughout Britain, much as the BBC's bands led by Jack Payne and Henry Hall had been in the 30s. But the orchestra that was appointed resident dance band of the BBC during the latter stages of the war caused far more controversy. Male band leaders, led by Billy Ternant, expressed their fury when Ivy Benson's all-girl orchestra got the gig. But as Ivy herself explained to Roy Plumley when she appeared on Desert Island Discs in the 70s, her band had actually played much more than just a morale-boosting part in the war effort when they were sent to entertain the troops in Europe.
2 brothers and a sister, Italians, they'd been brought over into Austria, and the border was closed, and they just couldn't get home. The 2 brothers were going to make a dash for it across the border and leave their little sister, and I was crossing into Italy, so the wardroom mistress, the driver, and myself decided we'd just put them in amongst the luggage. And we did, and they went on ahead. When we got to the Italian border, I was horrified to see it standing there. You know, it only had a cover over it, with the Italian guards walking round it. So I just collected all the bottles out of the bus, invited the guards to have a drink, and then they were so drunk they just passed us through.
And you got the children
over? Then I
got
the 3 children over. We all collected, put them on a train in Udine to Milan, and I haven't seen them since.
Immediately after the war, BBC Jazz and Swing Broadcasting settled down to a number of long-running series, and one of the most familiar sounds became the weekly BBC Jazz Club theme tune, written by pianist Billy Munn for the programme produced for many years by Mark White, and recorded by an all-star group of session players, including such key figures in British jazz as saxophonist Harry Gold, clarinetist Sid Phillips, drummer Max Abrams, and the trumpeter and jazz radio presenter Jack Jackson. The BBC Jazz Club was soon to take sides in the burgeoning stylistic dispute between the followers of traditional jazz and the new modern jazz style of bebop. When John Foreman took over the show from Mark White in August 1950, he announced,
"There will be no modernists on the Jazz Club. The music I know as jazz comes from the heart, not the mind. I intend Jazz Club to present the real thing, music with a real beat. There will be no bop and no progressive music."
Since the 1930s, jazz and swing musicians always had to pass a BBC audition. But with the hardening of producers' attitudes in the 50s, both traditional and modern jazz musicians felt aggrieved when they were not accepted for broadcasting. And among the famous names, all of whom did eventually become regulars on air but who were rejected the first time round, there were traditionalist Ken Collier, mainstreamer Bruce Turner and modernist Ronnie Scott. One of the first modernists to be accepted was John Dankworth, and in the early 50s his big band had a regular late-night show. Indirectly, this led to one of his biggest hits, as the band's pianist Dave Lee and John Dankworth himself recall.
I think it was called Johnny Come Lately. It was a late-night programme, and we had some great fun, particularly as we were doing that when the BBC had studios in Aeolian Hall in Bond Street. And upstairs in Aeolian Hall, at the same time, they were doing the Goon Show. And every night when the Goon Show finished, they would come down into the studio, our studio, to listen to our broadcasts. And there was one night when Spike Milligan insisted on playing the trumpet with the band in the middle of the broadcast, regardless. He just got up and started, and it was one of the most hilarious moments in the band's history. That was one of the things I remember of those broadcasts. But if you were to ask me if there was any one aspect which carves John a niche above anyone else in this country, I would say it's his arranging ability. He truly is, I'm not saying was, it's present tense, he truly is an extraordinarily good arranger. He always came up with something fresh and original.
One of the ideas I had to show my sense of humour was to take the tune Three Blind Mice and then each week play it in the style of a different jazz or swing orchestra, if you like. And so I did that every week. One week it was Benny Goodman, one week it was Glenn Miller, one week it was, Jerry Mulligan, so on and so forth. And I was recording at the time for Parlophone, and George Martin was my A&R man, as they called them at the time. And he said, "I thought that was a very good idea of yours to do the Three Blind Mice thing, and we ought to record it." So I said, "Well, how can you record it, George? These were in the days of 3-minute singles, and how can you do all that?" So he said, "Well, why don't you go away and think of a way of doing it, and when you got the idea, come to me and we'll record it." So I then had this idea of having 3 blind mice who lived in a recording studio. One was called Benny Goodman. I almost called him Benny Goodmouse, but that sort of thing. And the second one used to live in a mill, so they called him Miller, played a bit of Glenn Miller and that sort of thing. And it took off. I had no idea why George thought it would take off, but it took off, and it was in the, what did we call it those days, the hit parade for a long while, and put our orchestra on the map, or the big band on the map for the first time, I think, for a lot of people who weren't exactly jazz fans.
This is the saga of 3 blind mice who lived in a recording studio. They called the first one Billy May. The second they called Benny Goodman. And the third used to live in a mill, so they called him Miller. He was a romantic little mouse. They all ran after the farmer's son, who sent them stone deaf with a tunable drum. There were a couple of Irish cats around too. One was named Mulligan. The other wasn't exactly Irish, but he was a sort of Finnegan. Stan Kenton had never seen such a thing in his life as Three Blind Mice, so he wrote some music for the occasion. Theme for a trio of sightless rodents. Frightened the mice away.
Experiments with mice made a brief foray into the hit parade in 1956, but it proved that whereas John Dankworth was perceived as one of the young lions of modern jazz, his arranging and playing skills easily encompassed the entire swing era. By that time, Kenny Baker, who'd left Ted Heath long ago, had since 1952 been leading one of BBC Radio's most successful of all swing bands, his Dozen. And as this broadcast proves, if the music had come a long way from 1926, the BBC's announcing style was still firmly based on the Savoy Hill ethos.
The time now is 10:20. This is the BBC Light programme, also being broadcast on VHF in London and the southeast of England on a frequency of 89.1 megacycles per second.
Let's settle for music. This is Wilfred Thomas calling you in for another session with Kenny Baker's Dozen. Last Tuesday, we celebrated Duke Ellington's 57th birthday with a program of his music. We propose to carry on tonight, but to broaden the scope to include not only the Duke's personal compositions, but the music associated with his band in general. For example, our first tune tonight is by Billy Strayhorn, Ellington's famous arranger. And with solos by Keith Christie on valve trombone and Keith Bird on clarinet, we give you Buddha.
Kenny Baker's Dozen and Boo-Dah from the 8th of May 1956. A couple of years later, Humphrey Lyttelton, who'd made an almost complete transition from revivalist jazz to swing, put together a big band of his own to accompany blues singer Jimmy Rushing on a visit to the UK. As Hump's next announcement shows, the BBC still had some way to go to get studio concerts to sound informal. Not only was there a ban on commercial advertising of discs, but the studio audience was forbidden to applaud.
I must apologise for these long moments of silence in between the numbers. They're made by the studio audience we have here holding their breath. We have about 70 assorted members of the musical profession sitting in the audience here, and we're very happy to see them all. It'll take me an hour to pick them all out one by one. Jimmy, I should have explained that these numbers are all arrangements that you brought over from the States.
Yes, that's right.
Jimmy Mundy,
Buck Clayton, Nat Pierce, and I recorded this for Columbia in the States, Phillips over here.
Well, while they pick themselves up in the control box after that blatant plug, we're going to play a number now of blues entitled Harvard Blues.
And I wear Brooks clothes, white shoes all the time. And I wear Brooks clothes and white shoes all the time. Get 3 C's and a D, then check from Home Supply.
Jimmy Rushing and Harvard Blues, with a sumptuous tenor solo by Jimmy Skidmore within the ranks of Humphrey Lyttelton's 1958 big band. Since the 1950s, and a long time before he starred in I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, Hump's been a regular on BBC Radio with his Best of Jazz record programme. And at one time or another, he's also presented most of the other major jazz and swing radio programmes since the 50s, including Jazz Record Requests and Jazz Club. In the years that followed that last broadcast, swing at the BBC was gradually eclipsed by a wider range of jazz styles. But in the 60s and 70s, it was often at the heart of the musician profiles presented by Charles Fox or the studio sessions presented by Peter Clayton. It was through listening to them and to Steve Race on Jazz Record Requests in the 60s that my own jazz education began. In retrospect, I'm convinced that the most eloquent broadcaster we've ever had on the subject was Peter Clayton, a diminutive man who always managed to find the right kind of language to describe the music so that it painted vivid word pictures in the mind of the listener. There's no better example than my own first broadcast as a musician with Sammy Remington's band on Jazz Club, May the 6th, 1979.
Sammy's own tribute to George Lewis. Sammy Remington, clarinet, Johnny Parker, piano, John Cole, banjo, Alan Shipton, bass, and Al Wickett at the drums, the Sammy Remington Quintet. Well, the final number by the quintet reminds me of the first time I ever met Sammy to talk to. It was in a pub on Islington Green, and he was working with Captain John Handy, that almost unbelievably exciting alto player from New Orleans. The place was so packed you could have drunk the windows. And it was when I was listening to Captain John playing Hot Enough to Blister the Paint with Sammy on tenor that I realised I'd only really ever heard half the truth about New Orleans music, and that it was indeed where the whole of rhythm and blues had started from. Well, here's Rebecca.
Sammy Rimington's quintet from May 1979. And Rhythm and Blues at the BBC? Well, that's a whole other story.
Sammy Rimington's quintet recorded in May 1979, ending Alan Shipton's look through the archives at the history of swing at the BBC. The producer was Martin Smith.